cubes. That's what today was. Alright, chapter 2. It's time for Ikeda. I don't know. But anyway, no news of my father came forth the other day, and somber restlessness took hold of me. Originally, it seemed Hijikata-san granted me approval to accompany the captains on their rounds through Kyoto to search for my dad. Then he called me in. Sumimasen. I saw Okita and Heisuke had been summoned along with me, and I felt a partial sense of relief. It did a little to calm my chattering nerves, and I didn't want to be in a bad spot with Hijikata-san. You called me? Hijikata-san seemed to be in a foul mood, so I decided it was best to act with tact in his presence.
お前の行動さん探しの件だがな。しばらく様子を見ようと思う。
What? But why? We just started looking for him. Stopping now would surely cause any of our leads to run dry. His words stunned me. How could he back out on this? Hijikata-san remained deeply composed.
長州の連中が不穏な動きを見せている。本来ならお前を外に出せる時期じゃない。
I heard how the warriors of the Choshu domain associated with the Imperial Nationalist Party. For some reason, they find foreigners repulsive, using brute force to prevent any foreign presence. All of their faith is aligned with the Emperor. The Shinsengumi, on the other hand, serve the Shogun, meaning they are directly opposed. If the Choshu is active, it could mean that my own goal is of little concern to the Shinsengumi. I might become something of a burden to them. So, are you asking me to refrain from joining the rounds until things with the Choshu domain settle? Hijikata-san nodded and turned towards the two men.
というわけで、今日からこいつを巡察に連れて行くのは取りやめだ。
なるほどね。だから当番の俺らが呼ばれたってわけか。
Heisuke seemed 2 steps behind Hijikata-san's words until this very moment where it seemed to click.
でも今までだってこいつが巡察に迷惑をかけたこともないし、別にいいんじゃないかな。
そうそう、僕たちに何かあっても関わらないようにしてくれればそれでいいし、どさくさに紛れて逃げ出すこともないしね。
I won't run. I knew he wasn't being serious, but I couldn't stand to keep my mouth shut. I made up my mind the minute the men of the Shinsengumi agreed to help me find my father. I made a vow to never run from the Shinsengumi for as long as they helped me find my father. My desire to find my father showed no signs of slowing, even since I first arrived in Kyoto. I will keep my vow. So please allow me to continue looking for my father. I bowed to Okita, keeping my eyes locked with his. His smirk, however, shrunk slowly as he gazed towards me, caught in between words to say.
危険を承知でついてくるって言うなら、僕の一番組に同行してくれて構わないよ。それに、行動さんらしい人を見たっていう証言もあるしね。
確かにそういう証言もある。だが危険だと分かってるところにみすみす出すこともねえだろう。分かってるのか。お前らの足を引っ張りかねねえんだぞ。
I promise I won't cause any trouble. Please, if I lose the opportunity to search for my father, then the chances of finding him will sink. I lied prostrate before him, and Hijikata-san simply sighed heavily.
市中を巡察する組長の指示には必ず従え。いいな。
Of course. Thank you so much. I didn't know how else to show my gratitude, so I bowed deeply again.
行くか行かないかはお前が好きに判断しろ。
Alright. I had to make sure this was the best decision. There was something in his demeanor that made me unsure of my desire to leave the compound. Still, if I was with Okito or Heisuke, I'm sure I'd be safe and well protected. On the other hand, my presence could be an undue burden to them. What was I to do? Well, we're remaining in the compound, as the guide says. After contemplating, I decided to stay in. I couldn't convince myself that I wouldn't be a burden to them during dangerous situations. Still, it was disheartening to think about. Another dull day spent inside. Throughout the past 6 months, I was allowed to finally search for my father on the rounds, and I felt like a part of the house by contributing. Even though sometimes I was occupied with cleaning or cooking, it seemed like I was serving my part of the Shinsengumi in a meaningful way. I spent most of my time with the captains, but there were many opportunities to chat with the warriors and come to know them as real people. Maybe they were starting to think of me as a warrior in training rather than Hijikata-san's page. That's also the other bit. These worrying thoughts made me so anxious I was turning numb. The idea that I had become so dependent on the Shinsengumi at this moment. What should I do today? I was resigned to the consequences of my decision, something that felt like I was wasting away the tender moments of my life in these headquarters. I was, in short, with nothing to do. Alright. I decided to enter the inner courtyard, where maybe I could feel a pleasant breeze tingle my face in the shade. The quaintness may calm me down. Damn it. Oh, I know what scene this is. Alas, no winds blew through the courtyard today. No reprieve from the harsh sun bearing down upon this dry emptiness. I had a feeling it was going to be a bad day. Shade was the best I could hope for, it seemed. I sighed, sitting in whatever shade I could find. Something occurred to me as the sun roasted Kyo. Oh, right. My father's been here, hasn't he? They mentioned it, but they hadn't told me why. Was he tending to the injured, or perhaps educating the Shinsengumi on how to avoid illness? Neither of those things, but even if they did, I don't think they paid attention to it other than Yamazaki. Maybe he'd intended to stay here long term. My father never mentioned to have been with the Shinsengumi. He'd visited only a few times, or so I've been told. If he'd really been their doctor, then he would have visited far more often, which left me with the question, why? It was extremely clear to me that the Shinsengumi had plenty of secrets, but I grew suspicious that these secrets deeply implicated my father as well. No, that can't be right. Can it? I shook my head again, trying my best to dispel the dark thoughts taking shape.
何がまさかなんですか?
I spun around to find that Sanon-san had walked behind me, utterly undetected and unannounced. Oh, Sanon-san, is it alright for you to be walking around?
私が寝たきりの病人か何かのような言い方はよしてください。何の問題もありませんよ。
There was a hint of coldness to his words.
もっとも左腕は寝たきりですがね。
I couldn't bear to look at the sad, twisted smile he gave me. His arm hadn't healed, and it seemed certain now that it would never. The rest of the captain seemed sure that he would never be able to use his arm as he'd done before.
君こそ部屋を出ていていいんですか? 屯所内を勝手に動き回られては困ります。
I know. I'm sorry. They usually let me walk around as I please, so long as I didn't go into anyone's room. But I knew that technically I was confined to my room. Any freedom given to me was simply a courtesy. In other words, Sanan-san was right. If he decided to chastise me for being in the courtyard, I had no reasonable response. There were some things I wanted to think about. I hoped the courtyard would be breezy. The moment the words were out of my mouth, I realized it sounded far more like childish excuses than a valid explanation.
我々の監視から逃れて一人とは何か企んでいることでもあるみたいですよ。
I'm sorry. Still, I was beginning to grow accustomed to the subtle cruelty that seemed to accompany each word from Sanan-san's mouth. Ah, there's a phone call. I'll be right back. Alright, I'm going back to my room then. I turned and began to walk away. Sanan-san's unpleasantness had started after he was wounded during his trip to Osaka. He spent most of his time locked up in his room now, and he was quick to lash out on others in response. I knew the loss of his arm hurt him, more than I could understand, but I wish he could go back to being the warm, kind man he was originally. I'm going to bring this up when I talk about Sanan-san on the top 12 list. Don't worry. I turned around to see him still standing there. It's really hot out today. You should try and stay out of the sun. Please, take care of yourself. I gave him a nervous little laugh, and he responded with a chuckle of his own. His smile didn't look forced.
ありがとうございます。君も体調には気をつけてくださいね。
Okay. The Sanan-san I'd first met was still there. My spirits lifted. I ran back to my room. It was later that evening that the compound exploded with activity. I was walking down the hall when I heard footsteps and turned to see Nagakura coming towards me. Nagakura? What's that for? He glanced down almost absently at his hands, holding a candle and an exceptionally long needle.
長州の患者を捕まえたんだけどよ、なかなか口を割らねえらしいんだ。土方さんが直々に相手をすることになったんだが、道具が足りないって言うから持ってくところよ。
I don't understand.
こういうことは分からねえ方が幸せだって。
He gave another bark of laughter, turned his back on me, and walked off. Go ahead and do so. As the sun began to set, the activity in the compound reached a fever pitch. It was so busy that I couldn't even help with making dinner. The commotion was overwhelming. Heisuke! He shot past my door, then wheeled back around. What happened? All the men are running around. Any word from that Choshu prisoner?
ああ、あいつがようやく口を割ってさ。
I can't imagine how he broke.
今夜長州のやつらが会合するらしいんだ。で、俺らは討ち入り準備中ってわけ。
Oh. Heisuke went on to explain that the Shinsengumi would be splitting into two groups and searching locations at opposite ends of the city. Kono-san would take 10 men to the Ikeda Inn, and Hijikata-san would take 24 to the Shikoku Inn.
土方さんたちの行く四国屋が当たりっぽいよ。俺は逆方向だからちょっと残念だな。
They'd send more men with Hijikata-san because they thought he'd be seeing action. Kondo-san and his men were to make sure they covered all their bases. You mean there aren't even 40 men ready?
まあ肝心な時に暑さで腹を壊す奴らが多くて困ってるんだよ。
I'd known that the heat in close quarters made some men sick, but I hadn't known it was so many. Heisuke sighed.
会津藩や諸次第にも連絡入れたんだけど動いてくれる気配がないんだよな。
Sounds like you've got your work cut out for you. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could offer him apart from sympathy. I had a feeling it was going to be a difficult night. After all the men capable of fighting had left for their respective assignments, Sanan-san called for me.
もちろん名目上のことですが、私は局長から屯所の守護を仕切るよう仰せつかりました。
Sanan-san's passive-aggressive attitude reared its head.
手薄になった新選組の屯所が何者かに狙われないとも限りません。君は私の目が届く範囲にいてください。非常時には適宜私から指示を出します。
Okay. I hesitated a moment, then spoke. Does that mean you'll protect me? I wasn't sure why, but he laughed at that.
腹痛で寝込んでいる大使よりは私の方がまだ使い物になりますから。
Was I supposed to be happy? His smile was so sad, I wasn't sure what to say. It seemed to hurt him most when the other men were out fighting, and all he could do was wait. The silence between us stretched out until the door to our room suddenly opened without a sound.
三男総長、奴らの会合場所が池田屋と判明いたしました。
The best boy has arrived! The Ikdain?
それは困りましたね。新選組は意外と賭け事に弱いのかもしれません。
His tone was light, but his face was serious, and with good reason. It's not a dog! Well, I mean, people call the Shinzugumi the Miba Wolves, so on some stance could be correct. Yeah, dogs are bestest boys. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. They'd been certain Shikoku was the right location and only sent half as many men to Ikeda.
山崎君、一つ面倒を頼まれてくれますか。
The man who he'd called Yamazaki nodded curtly. He is a Shinsengumi officer and spy, as well as a member of the Watch. Despite not living in the Yagi residence, he is aware of my situation, because Yamazaki is part of the Watch.
まず敵の所在は池田屋であると四国屋へ向かった土方君に伝えてください。そして大変お手数なのですが、その伝令にはその子も同行させてほしい。
Wait, 待って。Yamazaki-san seemed just as surprised. I paused before thinking about what's next. なんで? Why me? Why me? I feel like if I were to go with him, I would only be a burden. Why did he choose me? I can't stand the thought of getting in someone's way and being the reason something bad happens.
足手まといといえども人数には変わりませんよ。
Sanan-san responded while giving me a cold gaze.
伝令に向かう途中、他の老師に足止めされるかもしれません。それ以外にも 長州側の遠兵が存在する可能性もあります。もし伝令の道中に敵と遭遇したのなら、土方君との合流も遅れてしまうでしょう。
Sana-san finished with the soft smile I hadn't seen him use for weeks.
さて、私の言いたいことはわかりますか？
はい。自分が長州遠征の足止めを行い、最悪は彼女だけでも土方隊に合流させようと。
What? It sounded as if they were suggesting if things went badly, Yamazaki-san would sacrifice himself.
もちろん山崎君が失敗するとは思っていませんよ。
Are you sure about that, Sanan?
我々には人手が足りず、君には仕事が多い。会津藩や諸子大への連絡も担ってもらわねばなりませんから。
One second. That would have Yamazaki-san running all across Kyo. I suppose it really drove home just how thin the Shinsengumi was stretched. And there's no other person that could do this job? What about Shimada? Shimada is another Shinsengumi spy who is trusted enough with knowledge of my situation. Sana-san shook his head. The Shinsengumi needed every single member they can get, and Shimada was with the Shikoku team. Which means that, apart from Yamazaki-san, I was the only one that could possibly serve as a messenger at the moment.
確か雪村君だったな。護身程度の術なら身につけていると聞いたが。
I do.
残念ながら君の安全は保証できない。それで構わないというのであれば、俺に同行してくれ。
If I tried to run away while we were out, I had no doubt that he would kill me without hesitation. This mission is his priority, not my life. Even so, I'll go. I can take care of myself. You don't need to worry about me. Sana-san gave me a small smile. I knew he wanted to join the battle more than anyone, but we both knew that wasn't possible. At least, the least I could do was carry out my mission.
では、総長命令、しかと承りました。
He bowed, then as he stepped out of the room and turned to me.
全力で俺についてこい。
I took off after him, my legs working as hard as they could. Into the dark street we ran. I discovered quickly that half a year indoors did little for my physique, and I was out of shape. After only a few blocks, I was gasping for breath. Yamazaki-san, who was running ahead of me, suddenly stopped and looked sharply behind us.
何があってもこの通りを走り抜けろ。後ろを振り向く必要はない。
Don't tell me someone's behind us.
君は知らなくてもいい。
Seems like Yamazaki-san's hunch was right. What should I tell Yamazaki? I promised to give the message. I understand. I will get the message to them.
そう言ってくれると助かる。後のことは頼んだぞ。
Got it. When we left the compound, I already decided that Yamazaki-san deserved my utmost trust. So, I didn't look back. As I stepped into the next intersection, I saw a flash of metal from the corner of my eye. I got a fixed night, but
君は惑うな。じきに合流できる。白の大福を目指してこのまま走れ。
right. I kept running. I pretended I didn't hear the sounds of swords ringing against one another behind me and ran. My knees felt weak and my legs shook, but I kept going. They'd have to collapse or tear themselves to pieces before I'd stop. Even so, I felt so slow. I wanted to cry out, to scream in my body, to go faster, faster! Ah! A bright light suddenly cut through the darkness, and I placed my hand over my eyes from the glare. My heart stopped. Was it Choshu soldiers? I froze.
何やってんだてめえは。
I very nearly began to cry with relief. Hijikata-san was not dressed in the usual light blue jacket, but rather a bright white uniform to be seen in dimly lit places. Instead, I simply collapsed as Harada reached out to grab me.
大丈夫か。勝手に豚書から出てると土方さんに怒られるぞ。
I grabbed a hold of Harada's hand and pulled my body to its feet. I wanted to tell them that I had permission to leave and explain that it was alright for me to be there, but I was so winded that I could barely speak. Besides, I wasn't sent to Hijikata-san to make excuses. I took as deep of a breath as my shuttered lungs could manage before speaking. They're meeting at Ikeda. Suddenly, Hijikata-san's expression changed.
本命はあっちか。
I nodded rapidly.
敵の会合場所は池田屋であると。
Hijikata-san gestured towards me.
三男さんなら脱走を見過ごさねえ。つまりこいつは早朝命令で豚書を出たってことだ。
よく俺らと合流できたな。今日の地理には詳しくないんだろ。
Yeah, Yamazaki. I finally got some of my breath back, and I did my best to tell them what had happened.
合図や諸次第はどうなった？もう池田屋に行ってるのか？
I just shook my head. Hijikata-san thought for a moment, then spoke.
斎藤と原田は隊を率いて池田屋へ向かえ。俺はよそで別件を処理しておく。
Harada and Saito-san nodded curtly, then turned to their business.
あんたもこれ以上の単独行動は危険だ。俺たちか副長かどちらかに同行しろ。
I still lacked the breath to respond properly, so I simply nodded. We both knew they couldn't leave me here, but whom should I accompany? That answer is simple, it's Hijikata. I want to see how many times we actually go with Hijikata for all of the routes. The prospect of being alone with him was rather frightening, but for reasons I still don't understand, I decided to go with Hijikata-san. We were quiet for a while. I felt like I should say something, but I wasn't sure what. Instead, I kept quiet. After a moment, he glanced down at me.
伝令ご苦労だったな。俺たちが先手を打てるのはお前の手柄だ。
I never thought Hijikata-san of all people would praise me for anything. My heart fluttered momentarily in my chest. But what did he mean by an advantage? If the battle at the Ikeda Inn had begun, it didn't seem like we had much of an advantage at all. We stepped from the alley into the central avenue. Hijikata-san, why are we out here on the street?
臆病風吹かすような連中は目立つことしか頭にねえって相場が決まってるんだよ。
I blinked, not sure what to make of that. Yamazaki-san appeared beside us without making a sound. Yamazaki-san! You're safe! He didn't seem to have been hurt at all, thank goodness. Yamazaki-san's eyes slid to me for a moment, then back to Hijikata-san.
池田屋の件はすでにお聞き及びかと思います。自分は会津藩と諸次第へも通達を行うよう三男総長より促されておりましたが。
だろうな。次の指示は追って出す。山崎はひとまず俺と一緒に来い。
承知。
腰の重てえ役人どもへは新選組の副長が直々に挨拶しに行く。
Deep in his cold eyes, I saw a spark of anger. They appeared as the words came out of his mouth. Lines of government soldiers marching towards us. There were hundreds of them marching across the entire width of the street, several rows deep. Now I understand why Hijikata-san took us out into the street. We would never have seen the government forces as we shimmied through the back alleys. There was something about their march, so slow and unconcerned, that lit the fires of anger in my eyes. The rest of the men are still fighting at the inn. The Shinsengumi had a few soldiers able to fight, but they were risking their lives for Kyo. Didn't these men have the same responsibility? Why weren't they rushing to help us at the inn? Perhaps my anger was more obvious than I realized because Hijikata-san gave a snort of laughter.
安心しろ。新選組を奴らのいいようにはさせねえ。
He stepped forward into the very middle of the street, directly in front of the advancing soldiers. All he did was move a few feet and turn to face them, but he held such authority in his movements. He could have easily been at the head of an army.
局長以下、我ら新選組一同、池田屋にて御用改めの最中である。一切の手出しは無用。池田屋には立ち入らないでもらおうか。
Even if I could see that the government men were going to protest Hijikata-san's proclamation, when Yamazaki-san leaned over to whisper in my ear.
もし池田屋に立ち入ることを許せば、長州浪士制圧すら彼らの手柄とされるだろう。
What? How could they? After all the Shinsengumi had done, it just didn't seem fair. But it's the men of the Shinsengumi who are risking their lives.
それだけ我ら新選組は軽んじられているということだ。副長は今たった一人で新選組のために体を張っておられる。彼らが池田屋に踏み込むことを許せば、その突入したことだけを喧伝するだろう。実際に突入した新選組の武勇はなかったことにされかねない。だからこそ副長は会津藩の介入を封じようとしてくれているのだ。
Yamazaki-san held Hijikata-san in such high regard. So when Hijikata-san said we have an advantage, this is what he was referring to.
しかし我々にも務めが。
小せえ旅館に何十人も入るわけねえだろう。池田屋を取り囲むくらいが関の山だ。それとも乱戦に巻き込まれて死にてえというなら止めはしねえが、我が身が可愛いならおとなしくしとくんだ。
Hijikata-san's tone, as much as his words, left no room for argument. Until the battle ended, he stood his ground and not a single man challenged him. Finally, the sun rose from the black sky. The raid itself had lasted only 2 hours. But for me, at least, it had felt far longer. There had been 20 Imperial Nationalists at the Ikeda Inn. The Shinsengumi had killed 7 Ronin and injured 4 more. I learned later that with the help of the Aizu Domain and the Kyo Judiciary Commissioner, they arrested 23 people. The owner of the Ikeda Inn had also been arrested for trying to help the Choshu rebels escape. The Shinsengumi had won an incredible victory, fighting against superior numbers in enemy territory, but they paid dearly for it. Okita had taken a blow to the chest and lost consciousness. Heisuke had been cut on the forehead, and the bleeding refused to stop. Nagakura had injured his left hand. One of the Shinsengumi soldiers lost his life at the inn's rear entrance, and 2 others were severely injured there as well. It didn't seem likely that they would survive. The Kyo military and judiciary commissioners also fought the Choshu Ronin. With their successful resolution of the Battle of Ikeda Inn, the Shinsengumi had, at last, made a name for themselves. It looked as though the peace in Kyo had been protected. Never could I have imagined that the ultimate result of their victory would be